So I finally managed to get through the Crewel World trilogy, and although it has been a while since I need to do a serious wrap-up video on here, I have not forgotten. Book 2, Altered, picks up where we left off at the end of Cruel with Ad, Joss, and Eric arriving on Earth, finding out that it's not a desolate hellscape incapable of supporting life. In fact, it's kind of opposite. While I would be rather reluctant to say that society on Earth is thriving, at least they're getting by. The world there is heavily impacted by Eris, which sits on top of a planet like a massive tumor. There is no sunlight in the areas where Eris is, yet people live directly under it, which makes me question how smart that any of these people actually are. To make the situation on Earth even worse, the people from Eris are sucking up raw materials from Earth in order to keep Eris functioning. This is important for later. On Earth, they eventually run into the leader down there named Kincaid. From there, the reader learns some more about how it is that Eris and the Smithers came to be in the first place. The timeline of this book was honestly a bit of a shock to me. I thought that it was like some sort of future hellscape, but the timeline on Earth is around 1960. 20 years earlier was obviously World War II. During this time, a bunch of people got together and created a project to try and protect everybody from the horrors unfolding in Europe. They started breeding these girls specifically for their abilities, each generation producing girls with stronger and stronger abilities. But Sophie, you cry out, how could there have been so many generations to hone these Spencer powers if only 20 years have passed? Here's the thing, Eris exists in a separate time than Earth. Around 200 years have passed in Eris, give or take, while only 20 have passed on Earth. Kincaid knows all of this because he was one of the original founders for Eris along with Cormac. However, Kincaid fled to Earth after a fight with Cormac. Cormac wanted absolute power for only himself. Kincaid wanted to push society into better things. It's not that I'm blaming Kincaid for knowing when to get off the sinking ship, but for sure leaving Cormac with basically unchecked power has only made things worse. When she's down there, Ad uncovers another truth. Men also carry the ability to manipulate the weave as well. However, they are called tailors, and their powers are a bit different than the spinsters. They've been hinted at during book 1, and I'm honestly not all that surprised that this was revealed. They told Ad that they're kept secret and usually behind closed doors. While the women work openly on stuff like weather and making the crops grow, the men do stuff like erasing people's memories and altering personalities. That's somehow worse. At one point, Ed meets a refugee from Eris who had recently arrived on Earth. However, when he tries to kill her, Kincaid orders that he be killed. A new character that Ed meets shows exactly how terrifying that Taylor powers are when he unravels the boy, which is to say that he plucks the thread of life out from him and he crumbles to the ground and simply dies. Grim stuff. On a more personal level, the first rebel that they meet is a teenage boy named Dante. As the plot progresses, Dante reveals that he's pretty sure that he's Ad's biological father. This is something that's only possible thanks to the fact that Eris is in a different time than Earth is. Dante had been forced out of Eris, lest he be killed for wanting to put a stop to all of this. He hadn't exactly known that Ad's mother had been pregnant at the time, and now feels really guilty about the entire thing. Do you remember the mysterious hourglass tattoo Ad's father had put on her in Book 1, Chapter 1? Yeah, that became relevant again. It's full of data for the rebels, which identifies that Dante is Ad's true father. Dante himself is a powerful tailor, and part of the reason why he was forced to flee was because he wanted to marry Ad's mother. The government said no, because I guess she had a powerful spinster heritage. The baby that they produced, obviously Ad, ended up not only being the crueler, but also a tailor, a power that girls rarely possess. There's also a subplot where we finally find out what happened to Ad's mother because I figured that she wasn't actually dead. It also resolves what was up with the creepy room full of ripped threads from people. The guild turns them into something called remnants, or rems for short. Basically, they take the soul out from the body and turn them into these kind of unfeeling zombies. The rems are sent down to Earth to remind everybody there who's really in charge, the people who can't be bothered to come down themselves. And Ad's mother is one of them, so to try and bring Ad back. And although it's her mom's buddy, and although the memories are still all there, there's no emotional attachment to anything, not even Dante and Ad. Ad obviously tries desperately to save her mother. At the end of Alter, Dante ends up taking Ad's mother away for her own safety, but we never have any sort of closure about what happened to her after that. It was kind of like the author forgot about the subplot when we moved into Unraveled. On an even more personal level, we have the continuation of the love triangle. This is made super convenient that Ad ended up going down to Earth with both of them at the same time. Whee! At first, things are going pretty well with Ad and Joss, but things start to get sour the longer Joss thinks about how much time is passing in Eris, that his lost daughter, Sabrina, is getting older and older as they putz around on Earth. And part of me gets it, but at the same time, I also feel like he kind of forgot that he was about to be murdered before Ad dragged him down to Earth. Besides that, it's not like Sabrina would remember him or her biological mother anyway. Things finally come to a head one evening when Joss implies that they'll go back to Eris, rescue Sabrina, and the three of them will be a family together. Ad is upset over being the replacement replacement goldfish mother to this little girl, which is completely justified. Never once did Joss ask Ad if this was something that she wanted, but in some way maybe she was a little right, because finding Sabrina was pretty much half of what he talked about. No sooner had Joss and Ad broken up than Ad literally ran across the hall to Eric's room. So much for that. Anyway, I'd hate to be Eric and realize that he was only picked simply because his brother was a self-absorbed weirdo with unresolved mommy and intimacy issues. Ugh. Throughout the book, Kincaid had talked about a secret weapon that could undo all of Ares called the Whirl. At the end of the book, Ad and a bunch of old and new characters end up going to Alcatraz Island, where they find, I shit you not, Albert Einstein. Why Einstein, you might ask? Don't worry about it, okay? He was such a non-character, it's almost insulting that the author included him in the first place. But Albert did say one thing, that the Whirl isn't a what, it's a who, and it's not him, but Ad. When Cormac shows up, because of course he does, he stares down Kincaid and realizes that she has a chance to kill one of them, but only one. She chooses Kincaid, if only because the entire third book revolves around finally bringing Cormac down, which I suppose is fair considering we spent a good chunk of book one building up his character. Kincaid was a minor nuisance at best. He barely had any actual impact on the overall story. If we're going to spend an entire book bringing down a bad guy, you might as well be the most developed one rather than the one who was shoved in at the last second and was poorly developed to boot. This launches us into the third book, Unraveled. We pretty much jump straight into the action by the narration showing us how little control that Cormac has over everything. He's lost control over one of the 4 sectors in Eris, and the Spencers are refusing to work. Cormac shows how he's been dealing with problems in Eris. He orders the entire sector completely and utterly destroyed. The only people who are allowed to leave are government officials, but only them and not their families, which one man laments. Cormac again shows that he doesn't care, and Coley tells one man that he could start a new family. Great man, so glad he's in charge. Said nobody, ever. After that, Ad is basically kept in prison in the Coventry, where most of the plot in Book 1 took place. Amy shows up a few times, but it's always left a little vague as to how much she actually remembers. Mostly Cormac got to her and brainwashed her. No weird tailor tricks necessary when good old-fashioned grooming can do the trick. It's also worth noting that, thanks to the time difference between Eris and Earth, Amy is now around the same age as Ad. Exactly how much time passed and how old Amy actually is was left vague, probably because the author herself seemed to struggle with keeping everything consistent. Oh, and Brianna is also now part of the rebellion. However, this mostly goes nowhere, which only makes it even more frustrating. I get that they're being closely monitored, but come on, try a bit harder. It's also frustrating that the narration went out of its way to establish that Brianna is now one of the good guys, but that, again, this went nowhere. The only purpose it served was to kind of highlight how deep that the rebellion ran. Furthermore, that Cormac's actions in Eris were hurting everybody, especially Spencers, who had been groomed to take over Ad. Mainly a good chunk of the first half of the book involved Ad sitting around and moping. She would sometimes think evil thoughts about Cormac and what she'd like to do to him, but it left me screaming, then why don't you? Over and over. And there was no point to most of it, and I have to wonder why any of this was included at all. Also, Mela is still alive. She served even less of a point than Brianna did. It was so dumb. She basically paraded around being the same sort of immature high school mean girl that she was in the first book. Zero explanation as to how she survived the end of book 1 when she fell through the hole. I'm not sure that I care all that much, though. Cormac kept insisting that marrying Ad was going to serve as a distraction. However, after a rebel attack at their engagement party, Cormac got spooked and decided to move the wedding up to later that week. When Ad was being rebounded, which was never actually explained, by the way, that Lorsil intercepts and pulls Ad into the rebel base in Aras. The base is in the sector that Cormac cut loose from the rest of the Eris at the start of the third book. It's still hanging in there for now. There are still people living there, but they'll quickly run out of food. They're mainly there because Sabrina was reported to be living there. They set out with a rescue mission to go get her, but on the way they encounter something even worse than the Rems on Earth. There are people who were infected with fabric moths that turn them into zombies, like literal flesh falling from their bodies, zombies. Wow, that sounds like a horrifying plague to unleash on Earth, you're probably thinking to yourself right about now. Don't hold on to this new plague, though. This was literally never mentioned past this one chapter. They find Sabrina, but her new parents have this plague, so they're quick to hand over their adopted daughter to Joss. To be fair, I think that they would have handed Sabrina over to literally anybody not infected at this point. After this, Ad finally reunites with Eric. They bang, although it's one of those things that's left to the reader's imagination. I mainly find it funny how people were complaining about this scene, even though I've read young adult dystopian novels that were much more graphic. But at the same time, these books are for teenagers. Let's not give them any more ideas, okay? In the morning, Ad still has her powers, because of course she does. Was anybody really surprised that purity standards for Spencers ended up being nothing more than misogyny and 100% about control? After this point, things start to move really quickly. Ed ends up in Cormac's office and begs him for the code to end this entire project, a backdoor that Albert Einstein told her was in place because every science experiment has one. Albert also told Ed that she wasn't actually the world and that it was simply a made-up term to give people hope. She's special simply because she's trying to be special. She isn't some chosen one trademark or whatever, and that was pretty much the main highlight of this entire trilogy. Cormac ends up killing Dante because of course he does, and although Dante had a bit more character development than some of the other random bit characters who'd been killed off earlier, I still kind of found Dante's character to be pretty lacking in depth. His death held no emotional impact in any way, and although Ad claimed that she was angry at Cormac, she didn't really seem to care either way. Although the last few chapters were pretty lengthy, it was mainly Ad sitting and begging Cormac to show literally any sign of empathy, which at that point he was trying to murder everybody simply to hold onto his power for a moment longer. Empathy is not a word in the man's vocabulary. In the end, Ad unravels him. Before he fully dies, he says the code word to end the project, insisting that if he's going to die, so should everybody else. However, bold of him to assume that the rest of the rebels weren't already working on this in anticipation of Eris collapsing. Down on Earth, with Eris unraveling, the ground under it sees sunlight for the first time in 20 years. Ed reunites with Amy, and the two of them go around to all of the Eris refugee camps up and down the west coast of America in search of Eric, Joss, and or Sabrina, because Ed had promised Joss that she'd take care of Sabrina should anything happen to him. Finally, she finds somebody that tells her that Eric was killed during the final fight to flee Eris. I have to give the author props for actually going through with it. She also reveals to Ad that Joss was still alive but badly injured. That tidbit mainly left me frustrated that the author would have spent so much time retconning the romance between Eric and Ad in the second half of this book, only for Ad to end up with Joss by default. Overall, this story gets a solid meh from me. I really like the world building, but as usual, I felt like the author didn't go far enough, that she never pushed herself to ask questions about this world beyond that initial setup level. And for a story called Crewel, in a world populated by magic spinsters and tailors, we hardly saw any characters doing any sort of loom worker tailoring, which is baffling to me. You give these characters literal magic powers and you don't use any of it? Also, there were a lot of terms that were thrown at us that were never actually explained. I complained in the first book that they did this thing called rebounding, but it was never actually explained. Rebounding was pretty plot relevant in the end of the series, but it was still never actually explained. I think that it's when the spinster plucks you from point A and puts you into point B, but the author never clearly thought to explain it to us. It's mainly frustrating because the editors never once asked for the author to include literally a line about what this even was. Not even at the end when it was obvious Ad knew, but the readers didn't. This is also something that I complained about in the first book, but this use of the term spinster was confusing to me. I actually learned this 100% independently of this series, but the term spinster was invented because of their spinning work. Back in the day, it was one of the few reputable jobs that a woman could have and could be completely financially independent of men, which men obviously didn't like, so the term spinster became a cruel jab to try and control them. The origin of this word is kind of a niche thing, however, as I said in my video commentary in book 1, you can't simply throw this term out there and expect for people to think of the original meaning, not with the second meaning has completely and utterly taken over. I kind of get where the author was coming from in not including this, however. It would be difficult to have an aside like that to explain to the readers the origin of the word and why these girls are called that, However, I feel like an effort should have been made. Literally anything would have gone such a long way in clearing up the confusion here. Moving on, I am honestly not quite sure how I'd even begin to fix this mess of a story. It's a lot easier for me to make sweeping comments now that I can big picture everything, but at the same time, it was such a tangled mess. The foundation was good, but as I said earlier, the author clearly never thought past the surface level of how things worked. Powers went unused, unexplored. While the villain was good, I think that it would have been a lot better if the misogyny and little child grooming aspects were toned down, like at least 50%. It was a little too much at times. The ending could have been a lot better, tighter. I don't care about Eric dying because I thought that the author was really great for having done that, but there was a lot that was left unsaid. Priyana, Mela, what the rest of the Earth thought about all this, how everybody else from Eris was coping. Overall, you had another sad series with a great idea that ended up going nowhere fast. What's worse is that I'm not even sure how to go about and fix all this.